Look directly at the objective situation that we're facing today. We are repeating one of the great failures of Marxism in history, the failure to stop fascism. Now, there was a book written by Wilhelm Reich way back in the day, a guy who was there during the rise of the Nazis. And he was a Marxist and an academic. And he described very well how it is that Marxists in Germany failed to stop the rise of the Nazis. And this is an objective fact. Did the Marxists manage to stop the Nazis from rising to power? Did they carry out the revolution they were planning to? No, they didn't. And there's a lot of dishonesty from Marxists surrounding this actual topic by coming up with lofty excuses as to why that happened. Oh, false consciousness. Anytime a Marxist ever uses the term false consciousness to explain something, you know they have no idea what they're talking about. They literally have no analysis as to why something happened, and they're too arrogant to admit that they don't know. Because it's nothing but a cop-out for not providing an analysis. And that's all it is. We have to acknowledge this if we are to get past it. We have to acknowledge that fascism is rising all across the world right now as capitalism further continues down a self-destructive course. And if we don't stop it, there isn't going to be a grand Marxist revolution. There's going to be a fascist revolution. History is very clearly repeating itself. Right before Hitler actually came to power, there was a tremendous rise in fascism, not just in Germany, but across the world as well. Germany was just the best example of it. It is the most extreme reactionary, political, and economic ideology that can exist. It is reaction taken to its absolute extreme. And what is probably the most important point here is that it happened in the most advanced industrialized countries in the world. The places where Marx specifically said would be the ones to lead revolution, were to be the ones who would go into revolution. That the advanced industrialized countries, the advanced sections of the working class would be the ones to actually carry it out. And historically, that did not happen. In fact, historically, that has never happened. That has been a consistent failure in the theory of Marxism. And once again, history is repeating itself. Marxist theory at the time failed flat out. Not just in terms of what happened in Germany, but what happened in every country around the world at the time. During the Great Depression, was there a great increase in Marxist parties or Marxist influence? Not really, no. Yeah, parties grew. But where are the victories to back this up? I mean, that's kind of the point, that as capitalism continued to decay, there was this idea that revolution is inevitable. It will just happen anyway. It just works. But it didn't happen, did it? There was a complete failure by the left, not just Marxists, to materialize anything. It didn't happen. In what was probably the objectively best conditions for building a revolutionary party, managed to manifest nothing. This is nothing more than a gigantic historical failure on our part. We failed. And that is an objective truth, which cannot be denied. Even Otto Strasser, who many alleged Marxists try to claim was a real socialist, except that they failed to demonstrate that he was a real socialist and ignore the fact that he was a Nazi and try to say like, oh, well, the Nazis purged him in the end, so therefore he was a real socialist, or some kind of complete nonsense like that. Even he, their hero, was actually laughing at Marxists. He has a great quote that points out how we failed and is basically laughing at us.
You Marxists always point to the theories of Marx. Marx taught that theory is confirmed only in practice. But you always come up with explanations for the defeats of the Workers' International. Your Marxism has failed. The defeat in 1914 you explain with the defection of the Social Democrats, that of 1918 with their politics of betrayal. And now you have new explanations for the fact that in the present world crisis the masses turn to the right instead of the left. But your explanations do not alter the fact of these defeats. Where, in the past 80 years, has there been any confirmation of the social revolution by practical action? Your basic error is that you deny or ridicule the mind which moves everything, instead of comprehending it.
Marxist propaganda at the time of the pre-Nazi Germany, as the Nazis were beginning their rise to power, where they didn't actually hold any office, they were just a political party. Marxists failed to do propaganda to the masses that outdid or convinced the masses to go with them instead of the Nazis. Face it, on the propaganda front, it was a complete and total failure. It was an absolute disaster. Because at no point did they update their ideology or tactics in any way, any significant way possible. Now, I can hear some people already screaming at their computer monitor right now. There is a difference between acknowledging that there's been a difference and actually incorporating that difference into your theory. All Marxists spoke about was the objective social economic conditions. While being true, that's all they did. And that's significant because so did everybody else, including the Nazis, including the church at the time. So they were not giving any kind of information like that. Part of their agitprop wasn't really any different than anyone else's. There was nothing that distinguished them in this way. Yes, they talked about very liberally about how capitalism leads to the problem. But in terms of the actual agitation and propaganda itself, they were basically the same as everyone they were competing against. And a very important point that Reich points out is that for all of the economic theory and social theory that the Marxists had, the Nazis won the propaganda war and won the country overall. Because their message about, just straight up mysticism beat objectively correct analysis of material conditions and social factors. This is undeniable. The Nazis only had really vague, ill-defined bumper sticker slogans, but they appealed to a very mystical character, a very mystical kind of essence. And the fact is, this did win over material analysis. It did win out over socialist propaganda. Reich says it straight out. Marxist politics had not included in its political practice the character and the structure of the masses and the social significance of mysticism. At the time, fascism was still a new phenomenon. It had not reached its height or its peak in the seizure of power by the Nazis. It was still a relatively new phenomenon. Even Lenin himself didn't really have all that much of an analysis about it because it was still new at the time. The real face, the totality of what was to come hadn't appeared yet. He couldn't have done an analysis on it. He died long before that happened. The point here is not any failure by Lenin. Lenin did as much as he could at the time. The failure belongs to the rest of the left, the rest of the Marxist community, for failing to update or take into account the Nazi phenomenon. Like I said, they acknowledge that it exists, but at no point did it update their theory. The actual dialectical materialist analysis had nothing to say about the Nazis other than to say, look, they're another tool of the bourgeoisie. Fascism is capitalism and decay. So tell me, what did that manifest into? Nothing. There really isn't a very good, full, concrete analysis of fascism and then an updating of theory to combat fascism that exists. Now, Wilhelm Reich himself wrote a book on the mass psychology of fascism. But it is not enough. The actual Marxist theory doesn't actually take it into account. It merely dismisses it as another function of the bourgeoisie. If that was true, and the materialist analysis of Marxism-Leninism pre-World War I was correct pre-World War II, how did the Nazis rise to power? And some will argue, oh, they got a military victory. They outnumbered us. They outnumbered us because the public was on their side. The Nazis only outnumbered us because people chose to support the Nazis more than us. That is a failure on our part to do our job. And today you'd be hard pressed to find any Marxists who will actually admit to this failing. The first step towards solving a problem is to first admit that it even exists. And that is something first world, not even just first world, even Marxists in general across the world, even the third world, don't really admit that this was a massive failure on our part. The fascist forces, the actual people supporting fascism that weren't even necessarily a part of the Nazi party, weren't just disgruntled middle lower class people. They were masses of workers as well. They didn't come to power by simply being ruthless and just taking it. They had mass support. That's the problem. That's one of the reasons why we failed, because our analysis had not taken into account this new phenomenon of fascism. It could have, because they were in those objective times and could have taken it into their analysis and understand and resolve the contradictions stemming from it. But they didn't. And I attribute that to arrogance. We use Marxism-Leninism, the highest stage of socialist theory, so therefore we can't lose. It is. And that is a complete ignorance that is propounded to this day. Oh, the revolution is inevitable because Marxism says so. Or we're Marxist-Leninists, we did the Soviet Union, so therefore we're going to win here. In case you haven't noticed, that didn't happen. The vast majority of the creation of socialist countries happened because the Soviet Union occupied them post-World War II. That's fine. That created socialism. That's fine. That's great to happen. But that wasn't a revolution from the ground up of the masses rising against the bourgeoisie. That's not what happened. There was a power vacuum after occupation governments were destroyed. And with the help of the Soviet Union, the socialist parties or the partisans took over. That's not the same thing as starting a revolution from the ground up with mass support and taking over. It's not wrong to use the Soviet Union in this way, but you have to admit that it's not the same thing as carrying out a revolution. Any criticism of the Marxists at this time have to acknowledge one thing, or any criticism in general has to acknowledge one basic fact. The point of Marxism isn't to give some kind of lofty statements about how poor everyone is and how much everything sucks, or even to point to goals and say, we are going to do this. The point of Marxism has always been a scientific analysis of the objective material conditions and uncovering the contradictions of the social forces that exist. any rightful criticism of the Marxists at the time is the fact that they failed to understand those contradictions, if they were even looked at all. I believe that they were straight out overlooked. It was just, oh, the Nazis are just another capitalist party. So, therefore the same thing as everything else. We're going to automatically win because Marxism-Leninism is the highest undisputed science. One of the things about science is that it updates, it takes in new information and changes theories accordingly, which is something Marxism-Leninism doesn't do and has not done since World War I, which is why it's wholly out of date and why Marxism-Leninism didn't achieve revolution basically in any other country. It sure as hell didn't do it in China. They literally had to update the entire theory for their own conditions, their own historical period, and their own country. And this has pretty much been the same for every other country that has gone into revolution. But somehow Marxism-Leninism is like some kind of complete super science that magically makes everything work and can never be wrong or out of date in any way, shape, or form, which is the opposite of science. And we're still seeing that to this day. Like, there are still people who are dishonest enough to literally pretend there is no such thing as a global class divide. Any debate on global class divide that happened in the past 10 years, we won. It is impossible to deny that there is a global class divide. It's just impossible. And anyone continuing to do so is nothing but, frankly, a dishonest reactionary who is a hindrance to Marxism as a socialism and a hindrance to revolution, not just here, but around the world as well. What was the failing of the Marxists at the time? All of their propaganda was objective material conditions. That's it. Just basically vulgar Marxism, reduced down to unemployment and low wages. That's it. Well, aside from that being true, everyone else was making the same criticism at the same time. So what's different? That was the propaganda. And so what? Trump is basically doing that now. And he's making completely false claims of being able to bring the jobs back from overseas, which isn't going to happen. There's a reason why those jobs are overseas. There's the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There's a word for this. Economism. Just reduce everything down to the objective material conditions and take nothing else into account. And then sit back and say, oh, right, this is it. It's going to happen. The revolution is here. It's going to happen any day now. And all through history since that time, Marxists have repeatedly done that during every crisis, thinking this is what was going to change it. This is what was going to do it. People said that during 9/11. And then the Patriot Act coming in saying this was it. People were fed up. And then a couple of years after that, it was once the real totalitarian nature of the Bush administration came in, they said this was going to be it. It's going to happen. And they said Bob Avakian's group said the same thing about the invasion of Iraq. There were protests against the Iraq war before it even started, which is something significant that had not happened in history. See, the masses are rising up. It's coming. It's going to be happening any day now. Did it? No. They did the same thing 2008, right after the recession that swept the entire planet. People were saying, oh, look at Occupy Wall Street. It's a spontaneous class consciousness that, oh, now the revolution is going to be here. And this wasn't just Avakian who was saying it. Basically, everybody was saying it. Look, it's happening right now. It's happening. Where did it go? Nothing. It went right into the hands of the Democrats. And any Marxists that tried to take any kind of leadership during that time, like Bob Avakian's group, got laughed at and thrown out. No, it's not happening. Here's the failure. Revolution is not inevitable. It simply isn't. You have to actually do it. Like, that's kind of the point. that even though Marx made this ridiculous notion that it was inevitable and that it was going to happen, he was wrong. Because if he was right, it would have been continuing to happen. It isn't. I know this may be hard for some people to understand, but Marx was not infallible. He made a theory. And his theory did not include things 200 years after his death that he could not have foreseen. And that's the reality. It doesn't, all capital needs to continue to survive is a destruction of capital so that it can rebuild. That's the whole point of crisis. Capital is destroyed and now it has room to grow again because of all that empty space that's been left by its destruction. That's literally how the boom and bust business, or as we say, industrial cycle actually works. Capitalism just has to go into a crisis and then it can rebuild until it comes up against environmental limits, but that's something different entirely. So what happened? According to Reich, and I believe he's absolutely true, there was an absolute ideological divergence that had never happened before in history. There was a ton of left economic sentiment and desire, but a completely reactionary social and political framework. Now understand that the Nazis came to power complaining about big business. Oh, look, everything's bad because big business takes too much, and then kind of appeal to either dog whistle or frequently straight out anti-Semitic remarks that everything would be fine if it wasn't those people that were interfering with it. But at the same time had this completely reactionary social character, talking about tradition and the way things used to be and all that same kind of nonsense that we're actually starting to see again right now, which is frightening enough. That divergence was not taken into account in the theory of Marxists at the time. Not in Germany, not in the rest of the world either. That is a failure. The objective material conditions and the social forces, there was no real singling out or an analysis of the contradictions in that. The middle classes and working classes ultimately sided with the Nazis because of that, because they did appeal to something. Whereas the Marxists were repeating part of the same Nazi message, but then not really giving anything else out. And that's a massive part of the problem. It should. Because we're doing it again. This kind of leftist rhetoric economically, but very heavy right-leaning socially, politically, is all happening again. What is it that people think the MAGA communists are? What is it people think Caleb Maupin is? They entertain lofty notions about leftist economics, but their entire social and political thing is completely right-wing. The idea that Trump is somehow communist is quite possibly one of the most idiotic ideas that has ever existed. A businessman who's even greedy and incompetent of the greedy and incompetent. This makes absolutely no sense. And just as the Nazis complained about big business but only gave lofty statements, so do they. So does Maupin. We need an economy that works for working families. Okay, what's your plan? We're going to make it work for working families. Okay, what's that? It's socialism. Okay, what, like actual socialism or like Chinese capitalism? Like what's the actual economic and social policies that you would put in place to do that? There's no answer. The same thing that the Nazis did. Give like just complete platitudes, bumper sticker statements like libertarianism, but then actually offer nothing as a solution. Because there is no economic theory behind that. It's just leftist sounding rhetoric completely used for a reactionary purpose. And we see another similarity with them as well. The Nazis constantly appealed to some kind of, and literally used the words globalist conspiracy. And that was pointed directly at Jews. We're seeing the same thing again. What is it that the MAGA crowd and the mopping crowd are still doing? They're pointing to a conspiracy by globalists and then pointing to LGBT and saying there's a conspiracy to groom our children. It's the same kind of conspiratorial nonsense in place of a concrete material analysis of how the world is, the economic forces and social forces there. There's a reason why the CPI, or Maupin's cult, doesn't have any actual analysis. There's a reason why mega communism is not an analysis of anything. They're just bumper sticker slogans and appeals to emotion and then appeals to conspiracy theories. Maupin does the same thing. Oh yeah, we're doing like LaRouche, which LaRouche was an anti-communist. This doesn't even make any sense in any way, shape, or form. It's just an appeal to right-wing, reactionary, fascist ideas. It is. You might as well stamp a hammer and sickle on the Republican Party. It's the same thing. It tantamount to nothing. The only actual difference is that in the end, both of them, being that the mopping crowd, the MAGA crowd, just turn around and glorify other capitalists. They sit there and make a cult of personality around Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. It's one of the uncomfortable truths that neither of them like to acknowledge is the fact that Xi Jinping is a multimillionaire, if not by now, billionaire landlord. And say, oh, there's no billionaires in the party. There's no millionaires in the party, but also socialist billionaires, which is honestly one of the most idiotically ridiculous things possible, to actually defend market relations, private property, private accumulation of wealth as somehow being socialist. This is what I mean when they say they have no material analysis. It's just China do good, therefore good. Like it's complete nonsense. This is completely anti-scientific because they don't do revolutionary science. That's the whole point. This is just empty platitude propaganda, bumper sticker slogans with no substance or anything in any way, shape, or form providing an answer for anything. It's just glorifying Putin and Xi Jinping. It's completely, blatantly, obviously right out there for everyone to see. Again, we reflect on the past. What happened during that time? 50 million people were unemployed in Europe. Hundreds of millions more were on the verge of starvation, or in the case of the United States, the famine of the Dust Bowl in which 7 million people died, with the U.S. government covered up by simply just not doing a census that year, which if you do the calculations on the years before and after, you can pretty much figure that out, that there's millions of Americans missing. So with that objectively great condition for building revolution, did it materialize? No, it didn't. And instead, the Nazis won and then proceeded to take the capitalist Nazi war machine to kill 75 million people in World War II. Nazi German imperialism. That was aided by the German people. Hitler was very popular. Largely because he was one of the few politicians who actually did what he said he was going to do. That doesn't mean he wasn't monstrously evil. Because there's a set of objective facts that to this day, Marxists don't want to admit. The Marxists pre-Nazi Germany failed. No Marxist theory adequately analyzes and accounts for fascism. There is no left in the first world. No, your college social group doesn't count. And no, your so-called party of 5 people don't count either. I don't know what the solution is. I don't even necessarily fully understand all the philosophical and dialectical nuances to fascism and how it manifests. I know that if you read the Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, you're going to get a lot of really good insight. And the fact that this was written, decades and decades and decades, almost 100 years ago, still resonates today is something significant. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that we can't solve the problem until we acknowledge that the problem exists. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.